I am Alan. I am 65 years old, and I recently realized the woman I vowed to love until death was actively trying to expedite that timeline. After I dropped my wife Valerie off at the airport for her business trip, my 8-year-old son Leo tugged my sleeve. He looked terrified. He whispered that we could not go home tonight because he heard his mother planning something important for us. I did not dismiss him. We hid. 10 minutes later, I froze when I saw the live feed from my hidden driveway cameras. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe a father will do absolutely anything to protect his child. Growing up in the quiet suburbs of Pennsylvania taught me the value of observation. I spent 4 decades working as a structural engineer and designing high-level security systems for corporate buildings. I built my wealth quietly. Valerie is 42 years old. She always believed my career ended in obsolescence when I retired 5 years ago. She saw me as a relic. She thought I was a tired old man with a heavy wallet who simply faded into the background of her vibrant social life. She assumed my knowledge of modern technology was limited to changing the television channels. She was dangerously wrong. Our marriage had grown cold long before this night. Valerie spent her days shopping and attending charity luncheons while I spent my time raising Leo. He was the unexpected blessing of my late 50s. He was the only reason I remained in the house. I endured the passive-aggressive comments and the emotional distance because I wanted Leo to have a stable home. I never imagined that the woman who smiled for our holiday photos was quietly calculating my exact expiration date. After leaving the airport terminal, I did not turn the car toward our sprawling estate in the hills. The sheer terror in the eyes of my son told me everything I needed to know. I pulled my heavy utility vehicle into the shadowed parking lot of an all-night diner on the edge of the county line. The neon sign flickered overhead. It cast a harsh red glow across the dashboard. Rain began to pound against the windshield. Leo sat in the passenger seat with his small hands gripping his seatbelt. I told him we were just taking a detour for some late-night pancakes. I needed to keep him calm while I verified his warning. I pulled my smartphone from my coat pocket and bypassed the standard home security application that Valerie had access to. Instead, I opened a hidden encrypted server I had personally coded. It was linked to a secondary network of microcameras. I installed these cameras myself during the home renovations 2 years ago. Valerie knew about the perimeter alarms and the doorbell camera. She did not know about the thermal imaging lenses hidden within the exterior masonry and the basement vents. I always believed a security system was only effective if the potential threat did not know it existed. The live video feed loaded onto my screen. My blood ran completely cold. 2 men dressed in dark utility uniforms were standing on my front porch. They were not carrying tools for a late-night repair. They moved with a tactical precision that immediately set off every alarm in my head. I watched as one of the men bypassed the digital keypad on the front door. He did not hack it. He simply typed in the master override code. There were only 2 people in the world who knew that exact sequence. I knew it, and my wife knew it. Valerie had given them the keys to the castle while she established her perfect alibi on a first-class flight to Seattle. I zoomed in on the feed. The men slipped inside the house. They moved directly toward the basement door. They carried heavy, unmarked industrial gas canisters strapped to their shoulders. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my breathing remained perfectly steady. Panic is a luxury you cannot afford when your child is in immediate danger. As a structural engineer, I knew the exact layout of the foundation of our home. I knew the vulnerabilities of our central heating matrix. I designed the house to withstand earthquakes. I did not design it to withstand intentional internal sabotage. I switched the camera view to the basement feed. The men set the heavy canisters down next to the primary gas line. They began to systematically tamper with the pressure valves and the ventilation shafts. They were not trying to steal my property. They were staging a catastrophic gas explosion. It was a flawless plan on paper. An old man and his young son die in a tragic accidental house fire while the grieving widow is thousands of miles away on a documented business trip. The resulting inferno would destroy all evidence of tampering. It would leave only the ashes of my legacy and a massive $20 million life insurance payout for Valerie. She wanted to erase us completely to fund her new life. Leo gripped my jacket sleeve. His voice shook as he asked if we were safe. I looked at my boy. He was the only genuine light in my life. A quiet, absolute rage settled over me. I nodded. I promised him that no one was ever going to hurt us again. I knew that calling the police right now would only trigger a panicked investigation. The men might flee before the police arrived. Valerie would simply claim absolute ignorance. She would act horrified that her beautiful home was targeted by anonymous vandals. She would realize I survived the attempt, and she would simply try again, using a much more direct and violent method next time. I could not allow her to remain a hidden threat. I needed to dismantle her entire life piece by piece until she had absolutely nothing left to fight with. I needed to vanish completely. I rolled down my window. I threw my personal smartphone directly into the rushing water of the storm drain below the curb. The device vanished into the darkness of the rushing water. That phone contained a global positioning system tracker that Valerie insisted we share for safety reasons. Now to her and her hired assassins, my signal was dead. We were ghosts in the rain. I stepped out of the vehicle into the cold rain and walked inside the diner. The smell of old coffee and fried food filled the air. The waitress barely looked up from her magazine. I walked straight to the small convenience rack near the cash register. I purchased a prepaid cellular phone with cash. I activated the device before I even walked back out to the parking lot. This untraceable piece of plastic was going to be the instrument of the absolute destruction of my wife. I watched the final moments of the camera feed on my laptop, which I kept securely locked in the glove compartment. The men attached a small blinking detonator to the main valve. They set a timer and hurried back up the stairs. They walked out the front door and disappeared into the night. I closed the laptop. The countdown had begun. I started the engine of my vehicle and pulled out of the diner parking lot. We drove into the darkness toward a cheap roadside motel across the county line. I drove under the speed limit to avoid drawing any attention. Every passing set of headlights felt like a searching eye, but I remained focused. Tomorrow the world would wake up to the tragic news of a devastating residential fire. Tomorrow Valerie would put on her finest black dress and pretend to weep for the cameras. And tomorrow I would begin pulling the strings that would hang her. She thought I was a fragile old man. She was about to learn that I was the architect of her impending ruin. The rain did not stop as I pulled the heavy vehicle into the gravel lot of the Pine View Motor Lodge. It was a forgotten place on the edge of the interstate. The neon sign buzzed a dull green, casting long shadows across the wet pavement. I left the engine running and walked into the small, dimly lit office. I paid the night manager in cash for 3 nights. I signed the registry using the name of my late grandfather. The manager did not ask any questions or look up from his small television screen. He simply handed me a heavy brass key attached to a faded plastic tag. I drove around to the back of the concrete building and parked in the darkest corner away from the streetlights. I carried my sleeping son into the room. The air inside smelled of stale tobacco and cheap industrial cleaning chemicals. I laid Leo on the bed closest to the brick wall and pulled the thin, scratchy blanket over his small shoulders. He did not wake up. His breathing was soft and perfectly steady. I stood over him for a long moment, listening to the rhythm of his chest. I felt a surge of protective instinct so powerful, it almost knocked the breath out of my lungs. My own wife wanted this beautiful, innocent boy dead, just to secure her financial future. That horrifying reality settled into my bones like cold lead. I checked the brass deadbolt on the door to ensure it was completely locked. I pulled the heavy blackout curtains tightly shut, blocking out the green glow of the neon sign. I turned on the small desk lamp in the corner and opened my laptop. I connected the new prepaid cellular phone to the computer using a secure encrypted cable I kept in my travel bag. I needed a ghost tonight. I needed a man who understood the digital underworld as intimately as I understood physical architecture. I dialed a 10-digit number I had memorized 20 years ago. The line clicked open after 2 rings. A gruff voice answered the call. It was Carter. He was a retired forensic auditor who used to work for the highest levels of the federal government. Decades ago, Carter uncovered a massive embezzlement ring within his own department. His corrupt superiors tried to frame him to cover their own illegal tracks and send him to federal prison. I provided the undeniable digital evidence that cleared his name, and I quietly funded his expensive private legal defense. He owed his freedom and his current lucrative private career entirely to my early investments. We rarely spoke these days, but the loyalty between us was absolute and unbreakable. I told Carter the situation in plain clinical terms. I did not use my name, and he did not use his. He listened in complete silence as I described the assassins and the gas canisters currently sitting in my basement. When I finished explaining what I saw on the camera feed, his voice dropped to a cold, professional whisper. He asked what I needed him to do. I gave him the personal telephone number of my wife. Valerie had confidently told me she was boarding a late-night flight to Seattle for a corporate real estate conference. I told Carter to find her exact geographical coordinates immediately. The silence stretched on the secure line as Carter worked his keyboard. I walked back over to the bed and watched my son sleep. 5 minutes later, Carter finally spoke. He told me the cellular signal was not moving at 500 miles an hour through the night sky. The signal was completely stationary. She was not anywhere near Seattle or an airport. She was at the Azure Crest Resort and Spa. It was an exclusive luxury hotel located just 3 miles across our own city. She was likely drinking expensive champagne in a penthouse suite, while her hired killers rigged our family home to explode. The sheer arrogance of her proximity disgusted me. I thanked Carter and told him to stay on the secure line. I switched the active window on my laptop back to the live video feed from my basement. The 2 men in dark utility uniforms were finishing their lethal work. They had successfully connected the heavy industrial gas canisters to the central heating matrix of the house. I watched closely as the taller man pulled a small rectangular device from his deep utility pocket. It was a remote detonator. He carefully attached it to the primary pressure valve of the gas line. A tiny red light began to blink in the darkness of my basement. The trap was perfectly set. They gathered their tools and walked up the wooden stairs. I watched them leave through the front door and disappear into the heavy rain. The most logical and immediate response was to call the police. Any normal civilian would dial the authorities and send a heavily armed tactical team to the house to arrest the men. But I was not dealing with a normal situation, and I was no longer a normal man. If I called the police right now, the bomb squad would arrive and disarm the explosive device. The local news channels would simply report an attempted vandalism or a botched robbery. Valerie would watch the news broadcast from her luxury hotel suite. She would realize the explosion failed. She would know I was still alive and unharmed. She would instantly play the role of the terrified and grateful wife. She would rush to the police station in tears and demand answers from the detectives. And then she would realize she needed to hire better professionals to finish the job. She would not stop. A failed explosion would only force her to try again with a much more direct approach next week. She might arrange a fatal car accident on the highway. She might poison my food. She might hire someone to attack us in a parking lot. I could not spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder while my son lived in constant agonizing fear. I needed to dismantle her entire existence. I needed to strip away her money, her resources, her pristine social reputation, and her freedom. I needed to leave her with absolutely nothing before she even realized she was under active attack. I looked at the blinking red light on my laptop screen one last time to burn the image into my memory. Then I closed the video feed completely. I picked up the phone. Carter was still waiting on the other end of the line. I instructed him to access my primary private corporate servers. I told him to bypass all the standard security protocols and enter the deepest level of the encrypted network. I took a deep breath to steady my heart rate. I gave Carter the verbal command to initiate the Archangel protocol. Carter hesitated for a fraction of a second. He knew exactly what that specific command meant. It was a complex digital sequence I designed years ago for an absolute worst-case scenario. It was a total financial scorched earth maneuver. It would permanently sever every financial tie lock, every joint corporate asset, and reroute every single piece of intellectual property I owned into impenetrable offshore blind trusts. It would turn my massive liquid wealth into an untouchable ghost. Carter confirmed the final command. I heard the rapid aggressive clicking of his mechanical keyboard through the speaker. The protocol was officially active and spreading through the banking mainframes. By the time the sun came up tomorrow morning, my wife would wake up in her hotel bed, believing she was a wealthy widow holding a $20 million life insurance policy. She would soon discover she was entirely penniless and trapped in a nightmare of her own making. I hung up the phone and walked over to the window. I pulled the heavy curtain back just a fraction of an inch to look at the empty, wet parking lot outside. The rain was washing the dirty world clean. Valerie wanted to erase my existence tonight. Instead, she had just unleashed a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose and everything in the world to protect. The pale light of morning slowly crept through the narrow gap in the heavy blackout curtains of the motel room. The violent rainstorm from the previous night had finally passed, leaving a heavy and damp silence in its wake. I had not slept a single second since we arrived. I sat motionless in the uncomfortable wooden chair near the window, staring at the dark screen of my laptop. Leo shifted quietly on the thin mattress across the room. He pulled the scratchy synthetic blanket up to his chin. His chest rose and fell in a peaceful and steady rhythm. He was entirely unaware of the invisible war currently raging around us. I rubbed my tired eyes, feeling the coarse stubble on my jaw. The Archangel protocol was already fully deployed. My visible financial footprint was currently being erased from the standard banking system. But I knew Valerie too well. I knew her relentless ambition and her meticulous nature. She was a woman who never relied on a single strategy when dealing with high stakes. She would have built a legal safety net just in case her explosive plan failed. I needed to find that hidden net, and I needed to cut the ropes before she even woke up. My new prepaid phone vibrated silently on the cheap laminate desk. It was exactly 6 o'clock in the morning. Carter was calling me back. I answered the phone on the first ring, keeping my voice low so I would not wake my sleeping son. Carter sounded exhausted, but his tone remained razor-sharp and completely professional. He told me he had spent the last 4 hours systematically breaching the digital registry of the county courthouse. He used his decades of forensic auditing experience to bypass their rudimentary local network firewalls. He was looking for any recent legal filings or administrative requests attached to my name or my social security number. He found something buried deep in the pending administrative queue. It was a document filed just yesterday afternoon while I was busy helping Leo with a school science project at our kitchen table. Carter read the title of the document to me over the secure encrypted line. It was a comprehensive medical power of attorney. I asked Carter to read the specific details of the legal filing. My blood turned to absolute ice as I listened to his steady voice narrating the betrayal. Valerie had not just claimed to a judge that I was getting a little forgetful in my old age. She had submitted a heavily detailed and certified medical evaluation signed by a prominent private neurologist in the city. This was a doctor I had never met or spoken to in my entire life. This corrupt physician certified under oath that I was currently suffering from severe and rapidly advancing dementia. The forged medical file claimed I was prone to sudden violent outbursts and extended periods of absolute disorientation. It stated explicitly that I was entirely incapable of managing my own physical safety or my complex financial affairs. Valerie had essentially purchased a legal document that erased my autonomy as a human being. She had weaponized the legal system to declare me a living ghost. This fraudulent document granted her absolute and immediate control over my healthcare decisions and every single liquid asset I possessed the moment a judge declared me legally incapacitated. The sheer cold calculation of her plan began to unfold perfectly in my analytical mind. The gas explosion at our home was never meant to look like a simple household accident. If I somehow survived the blast, the medical power of attorney was her ultimate insurance policy. She would have rushed to my hospital bed, playing the role of the devastated and loving wife for the news cameras. She would use the forged dementia diagnosis to confidently explain to the fire investigators why I supposedly tampered with the dangerous gas lines in a state of severe mental confusion. She would have me quietly institutionalized in a secure private psychiatric facility where no one would ever hear my voice or believe my warnings again. And if the explosion succeeded as she originally intended, she would trigger the immediate payout of my primary life insurance policy. It was a comprehensive corporate policy I purchased decades ago to protect my family. It was worth exactly $20 million upon my accidental death. My hand tightened around the plastic casing of the prepaid phone. I finally understood the most horrifying piece of the puzzle. I understood why she included my 8-year-old son in her brutal assassination plot. Leo was the primary beneficiary of my estate, according to my standard will. If I died alone in a tragic accident, Leo would inherit the majority of my wealth, and the massive insurance payout would be placed in a protective trust for his future. Valerie would only receive a fraction of the money as my surviving spouse. She could not allow a surviving heir to stand between her and absolute limitless wealth. She needed us both to turn to ashes in that basement so she could claim the entire fortune as the sole surviving family member. She was perfectly willing to burn an innocent child alive just to secure her luxurious lifestyle. The cold logic of her greed was staggering, and it completely erased any lingering trace of mercy I might have held for her. I thanked Carter for uncovering the courthouse filing. I told him to stay on the line because we had one more critical task to complete before the city woke up and the banks opened their doors. Valerie firmly believed my wealth was sitting in our shared checking accounts and traditional stock portfolios. She thought freezing those accessible assets would simply be a temporary annoyance she could easily reverse with her forged medical documents. She was entirely unaware of the true foundation of my financial empire. During my 40-year career as a structural engineer, I did not just design physical buildings. I designed and patented the complex digital security firewalls that protected those commercial structures. Those specific patents were leased by massive multinational corporations and various federal agencies. They generated millions of dollars in passive revenue every single year. I never kept those valuable patents in my own name or in any domestic bank. I held them securely within a private offshore holding company based in a jurisdiction that completely ignored local civil court orders. Valerie never knew this holding company existed because the revenue was quietly reinvested into international commercial properties long before she ever entered my life. I opened a new, heavily encrypted browser window on my laptop. I logged into the primary server of my offshore holding company. The digital interface was completely blank, requiring a 32-character alphanumeric sequence that existed only in my memory. I typed the complex code flawlessly, without hesitation. The dashboard loaded, displaying the massive valuation of my intellectual property. Valerie thought her forged medical power of attorney gave her the permanent keys to my kingdom. I decided to simply vaporize the kingdom right in front of her. I initiated the permanent legal transfer of every single patent, every corporate lease, and every international property into an irrevocable blind trust. This specific type of financial trust is an absolute legal fortress. Once the assets are transferred inside, they cannot be touched, altered, or retrieved by anyone, including the person who created the trust. I designated my sleeping son, Leo, as the sole and absolute beneficiary of this massive fortune. The money would be held securely and grow exponentially until his 25th birthday. I named Carter as the absolute executor of the trust. Carter would manage the assets with his legendary forensic precision, ensuring not a single penny could ever be accessed or manipulated by my wife or any of her corrupt associates. The legal transfer required 3 digital signatures and a secure biometric verification. I pressed my thumb firmly against the scanning device integrated into my keyboard. The remote system processed the massive international request for 10 agonizing seconds. Then a solid green confirmation message appeared on the screen. The transfer was complete and permanently binding under international corporate law. I closed the laptop quietly. The sun was fully above the horizon now, casting a bright, harsh light across the wet motel parking lot. My wife was likely waking up right now in her luxurious resort suite. She would order expensive room service and casually check the morning news, expecting to see the burning wreckage of our family home. She believed she was waking up as a wealthy, grieving widow, completely free of her burdens and instantly richer by $20 million. She had absolutely no idea that her meticulously planned inheritance had just dropped to zero. She did not know that her expensive forged medical documents were now completely worthless pieces of paper. I had successfully moved my entire empire behind a reinforced wall she could never climb. She was a predator who had just stepped blindly into a carefully designed trap, and the steel jaws were about to snap shut. The damp silence of the motel room felt heavy as I watched the sun fully rise over the wet pavement outside. My financial fortress was now entirely secure, but my work was far from finished. I needed to understand exactly who was hunting us. I picked up the prepaid cellular phone from the cheap laminate desk and told Carter we needed to shift our focus back to the security footage from my basement. I told him I needed absolute clarity on the 2 men who had just rigged my family home to explode. Carter did not hesitate. He had already downloaded the high-definition video files from my hidden cameras before Valerie could attempt to erase the cloud storage. Carter ran the video feed through an advanced facial recognition software he utilized for corporate espionage investigations. He isolated the faces of the 2 intruders, capturing clear images when they briefly looked up toward the ventilation shafts. The software scanned through various state and federal databases looking for a match. The results populated on Carter's screen within minutes. He read the information to me in his steady, clinical voice. The first man was named Brody. He was a disgraced former structural contractor who lost his commercial demolitions license 5 years ago due to gross negligence and reckless endangerment. Brody was a known mercenary in the underground construction world. He was a man willing to perform highly illegal and dangerous work for a quick cash payout. He was a lethal tool, but he was not the architect of this nightmare. The second man was the real threat. Carter pulled up the profile of the taller man who had personally armed the remote detonator on my gas line. His name was Pierce. He was a prominent commercial real estate developer operating right here in our city. Pierce was a man who frequently appeared in local business magazines, standing proudly in front of half-built luxury condominiums and high-end shopping centers. He portrayed himself to the public as a massive success. He drove expensive imported sports cars and wore custom-tailored suits to charity events. I asked Carter why a supposedly wealthy real estate mogul was crawling around my dusty basement in the middle of the night, planting industrial explosives. Carter grew very quiet on the line. He told me to prepare myself for what he was about to say. Carter had already cross-referenced Pierce's identity with the digital footprint of my wife. He accessed Valerie's private cellular billing records and compared them to Pierce's personal electronic calendar. The pattern they left behind was incredibly sloppy and completely undeniable. They had been spending 2 afternoons a week together at the Azure Crest Resort for the past 11 months. Pierce was not just a hired assassin doing a favor for a friend. He was Valerie's secret lover. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The betrayal I was facing was not just a matter of financial greed. It was a deeply personal violation of everything I thought my marriage represented. I turned my head and looked at Leo sleeping peacefully on the narrow motel bed. His small chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, completely unaware of the monsters circling him. His own mother was actively plotting to murder him alongside me, just so she could begin a glamorous new life with another man. The anger inside my chest shifted from a hot, chaotic flame into a freezing, solid block of ice. I did not feel sorrow or heartbreak. I only felt a profound and terrifying sense of purpose. I asked Carter to explain Pierce's true motivation, because wealthy men do not risk federal prison sentences unless they are incredibly desperate. Carter dug deep into the private financial records of Pierce's real estate development company. The public image of success was a complete fabrication. Pierce was entirely bankrupt. His business empire was a hollow shell built on a foundation fit of massive predatory loans. His latest luxury condominium project had stalled due to severe mismanagement, and the aggressive lenders were now demanding immediate repayment. Pierce owed exactly $5 million to a ruthless private equity firm based in Chicago. If he did not produce the cash within the week, he would lose every single property he owned and likely face severe federal fraud charges for misappropriating investor funds. He was a desperate, terrified man backed into a dark corner. The entire assassination plot finally made perfect logical sense. Valerie had promised Pierce my $20 million life insurance payout. She promised to clear his massive debts completely and fund their luxurious future together with my money. All Pierce had to do was eliminate the only two obstacles standing in their way. I was an obstacle. My innocent 8-year-old son was an obstacle. They honestly believed we were just inconvenient numbers on a spreadsheet that they could easily erase with a single spark. I asked Carter to give me the exact name of the private equity firm holding the massive debt portfolio of my wife's lover. Carter read the name of the Chicago firm aloud over the phone. A rare, genuine smile crossed my face for the first time since this long nightmare began. The universe has a strange way of balancing the scales of justice. The private equity firm was managed by a man named Nolan. 20 years ago, Nolan was a brilliant but financially struggling graduate student who interned at my engineering firm. I saw his raw potential, and I personally mentored him. I provided the crucial seed money that launched his very first independent investment fund. Nolan never forgot what I did for him when he was a nobody. We had maintained a deep mutual respect over the decades. I told Carter to pause his digital surveillance for a few minutes. I dialed Nolan's private direct cellular line using my untraceable burner phone. It was still very early in the morning, but Nolan answered the call immediately. He recognized my voice instantly, despite the years that had passed since we last spoke. I did not waste his time with polite small talk. I told him I had a highly sensitive and immediate business proposition that required absolute discretion. I explained that I wanted to purchase the entire debt portfolio of a local commercial developer named Pierce. Nolan was a shrewd and calculating businessman, but he did not ask me any unnecessary questions. He simply stated the reality of the situation. He told me the debt was incredibly toxic, and his firm had been actively trying to offload it to collection agencies for weeks. He offered to sell the portfolio to me at a significant discount if I could provide immediate liquidity. I calmly declined the discount. I told him I would pay the full $5 million in cash through one of my anonymous proxy corporations before the morning banking hours officially began. My only condition was that the transfer must be executed silently immediately and with no public record of my personal involvement. Nolan agreed without hesitation. He sent the complex digital transfer paperwork directly to Carter on the secure server. Carter processed the massive payment using funds drawn directly from my newly secured offshore accounts. The required money was wired instantly across the country. The digital signatures were verified and finalized in a matter of moments. Within 30 minutes, the transaction was completely finished and legally binding. The private equity firm in Chicago no longer had any connection whatsoever to Pierce or his failing business. I was now the sole owner of Pierce's massive $5 million debt. I was legally his absolute financial master. I sat back in the uncomfortable wooden chair and let the beautiful irony of the situation settle into my mind. Pierce had spent the entire night crawling through the dirt and the shadows of my basement. He had risked a lifetime in a federal penitentiary to plant a bomb that he honestly believed would solve all of his problems. He thought he was murdering an unaware, fragile old man to secure a golden future with my wife. He had absolutely no idea that while he was busy playing with industrial gas valves, I was busy buying his entire life. Pierce thought he was a dangerous predator hunting weak prey. He did not realize he was just a very small fish swimming blindly into a massive, inescapable net. He would wake up in his luxury resort suite today, expecting to hear the sirens and watch my house burn to the ground on the morning news broadcasts. Instead, he would eventually discover that the very man he tried to assassinate was now the only person standing between him and absolute total destruction. I held the leash now, and I fully intended to pull it so hard that it would break his entire world apart. I watched the digital clock on the cheap motel nightstand slowly turn to noon. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress and turned on the small television secured to the wooden dresser. I kept the volume extremely low. Leo was sitting at the small laminate table eating a bowl of sugary cereal we bought from the lobby vending machine. He was watching an animated show on my laptop, completely insulated from the dark reality unfolding around us. I switched the television to the primary local news channel. I knew Valerie would not waste any time taking control of the public narrative. She needed to establish her airtight alibi and her absolute innocence immediately. The screen flickered, and there she was. Valerie stood in front of the heavy iron gates of our sprawling estate. The violent rainstorm from the previous night had cleared, leaving a bright and sunny afternoon that contrasted sharply with her dark mourning clothes. She wore a simple black dress and a conservative gray cardigan. Her makeup was perfectly applied, to look as though she had been crying for hours without sleep. She held a crumpled white tissue in her trembling hands. A local reporter stood next to her holding a microphone with a deeply sympathetic expression. Valerie looked directly into the camera lens. She squeezed out perfect rehearsed tears. She pleaded with the public for any information regarding her missing husband and her beloved young child. Her performance was absolutely flawless and entirely sickening. She told the reporter that she had returned early from her important business trip to Seattle because she had a terrible sinking feeling in her chest. She lied with such profound conviction that anyone who did not know the truth would feel an overwhelming sense of pity for her. She went on to explain that my mind had been failing rapidly over the past few weeks. She subtly referenced the forged medical documents without explicitly naming them on the air. She claimed I was suffering from severe dementia and that I had recently become prone to paranoid delusions and dangerous confusion. She painted a tragic picture of a lost old man who likely packed his son into the car in the middle of the night and simply drove off the highway into a hidden ditch. She played the role of the devoted young wife perfectly. She begged me to come home if I was somehow watching. She begged anyone who saw our heavy utility vehicle to call the police immediately. I stared at the television screen, feeling a deep and profound disgust settling into my bones. The woman I had shared my home with was a sociopathic phantom. I then noticed a familiar figure standing respectfully in the background just over her right shoulder. It was Pierce, the bankrupt real estate developer who had crawled through my basement trying to blow up my house, was now playing the role of the supportive family friend. He wore a dark tailored suit and kept his hands clasped solemnly in front of him. He occasionally reached out to gently touch Valerie on the shoulder, offering fake comfort for the cameras. The absolute audacity of the two secret lovers standing together on national television, pretending to mourn the very people they had just tried to incinerate, was staggering. I knew the local police were currently searching the state highways and the surrounding dense forests for my vehicle. They were wasting valuable time and taxpayer resources looking for an old man with dementia who had supposedly wandered away from his beautiful home. I needed to redirect their entire investigation. I needed to point a massive, unforgiving spotlight directly onto Pierce and his crumbling empire. I opened my leather travel bag and retrieved a small digital voice-altering device I occasionally used for corporate security testing. I connected the device to the microphone of my untraceable prepaid cellular phone. I adjusted the frequency dials until my voice sounded like a raspy, nervous stranger calling from a public payphone. I dialed the direct tip line for the local news station that was currently broadcasting Valerie's tearful interview. The operator answered the call almost immediately. I spoke with a carefully feigned sense of urgency and hesitation. I told the operator that I did not want to get involved with the police, but I had seen something very important. I told them I recognized the older man and the little boy from the news broadcast. I claimed I saw them early this morning wandering around a very specific commercial location. I gave the operator the exact street address of Pierce's largest half-finished luxury condominium project on the east side of the city. I described the massive stalled construction site, perfectly noting the rusted cranes and the chain-link fences. I told the operator the old man looked terribly confused and that he was walking his son near the large green commercial dumpsters at the very back of the property. I hung up the phone abruptly before the operator could ask for my name or any further identifying details. I immediately called Carter back on the secure encrypted line. I told him to patch my laptop audio directly into the encrypted radio frequencies used by the local police dispatch. I wanted to hear the exact moment the trap closed around Pierce. Carter executed the complex digital command in less than a minute. The low static of the police scanner filled my earpiece. Within 5 minutes, I heard the news station transfer my anonymous tip directly to the Central Police Precinct. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio, ordering all available patrol units to converge on the east side construction site belonging to Pierce's development firm. I turned my attention back to the television screen. The news anchor in the studio suddenly interrupted the live broadcast to announce a breaking development in the case. They stated that a highly credible tip had just placed the missing father and son at a local commercial construction site. The camera cut back to Valerie and Pierce standing outside my estate. Pierce's face immediately drained of all color. He looked like a man who had just been struck by an invisible train. His eyes darted nervously around the area, entirely forgetting the cameras. He knew exactly what was located at that specific construction site. He had assumed my house would explode and all the evidence would burn to ash. When the explosion failed to happen, he had to quickly dispose of the dangerous materials before the sun came up and his contractors arrived. I knew Pierce was arrogant, and I knew he was incredibly sloppy under pressure. A desperate man in a blind rush does not drive hours into the wilderness to hide his crimes. He uses the closest and most convenient hiding spot he personally controls. The police scanner in my ear erupted with chaotic chatter. Multiple police cruisers had arrived at the muddy construction site. The officers fanned out across the abandoned property, looking for a confused old man and a frightened little boy. They searched the half-built concrete structures and the empty cement foundations. They did not find me, and they certainly did not find Leo. But they followed the precise directions from my anonymous tip. They walked straight toward the large green commercial dumpsters sitting near the back fence of the property. A senior officer's voice came over the radio, sounding incredibly tense and breathless. He requested an immediate tactical bomb squad to his exact location. He told the central dispatcher they had not found the missing persons, but they had found something highly suspicious and extremely dangerous. Inside the commercial dumpsters, carelessly covered by a few torn pieces of drywall and empty cement bags, were 2 heavy industrial gas canisters. They were the exact same canisters Pierce and his hired accomplice had carried into my basement the previous night. Pierce had hastily disconnected them when the detonator failed to trigger and dumped them in his own trash receptacles, believing no one would ever search a stalled and abandoned construction site. The officers noted over the radio that the canisters had heavily modified pressure valves and remnants of tactical ignition wiring attached to them. It was undeniably the foundation of a massive lethal explosive device. The police immediately secured the perimeter and established a massive active crime scene right in the middle of Pierce's real estate property. The investigation was no longer a simple case of a wandering old man with a failing mind. It had instantly escalated into a severe criminal investigation involving industrial explosives and potential domestic violence. Pierce had just provided the police with the exact physical evidence needed to lock him in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess against a weak and oblivious opponent. He was actually just digging his own grave, and I had just handed the police the absolute perfect shovel. I kept the earpiece pressed firmly against my ear, listening to the police scanner. The scene at the abandoned construction site was unfolding exactly as I had calculated. A senior detective approached Pierce. Pierce tried to rely on his usual arrogance. He puffed out his chest and spoke in the condescending tone he reserved for city inspectors and laborers. He demanded to know why his private property was being swarmed by law enforcement. The detective did not back down. He calmly led Pierce toward the back of the lot, where the commercial dumpsters were secured by crime scene tape. The detective pointed directly at the two heavy industrial gas canisters. I listened as Pierce's confident facade completely shattered. His voice cracked as he attempted to explain away the lethal hardware. He claimed the canisters were simply standard equipment left behind by a negligent demolition crew. He said he was planning a controlled structural takedown of a concrete foundation next week. It was a pathetic and desperate lie. The detective immediately dismantled his excuse. The detective noted aloud that standard demolition crews do not modify pressure valves with remote tactical wiring. They do not hide their expensive equipment under discarded drywall in a garbage bin. The detective asked Pierce directly why he was sweating so profusely on a cool morning. Pierce stammered. He could not form a coherent sentence. The audio feed captured his heavy, panicked breathing. The police did not place him in handcuffs right at that moment, because they needed to formally process the explosive evidence, but the detective issued a stern verbal warning. He told Pierce he was officially a person of interest in a felony investigation, and explicitly ordered him not to leave the city limits. Pierce did not stay at the site to answer any more questions. I heard the aggressive roar of his luxury sedan engine roaring to life. He peeled out of the muddy parking lot and sped away. I called Carter immediately. I asked him to track Pierce's location using the traffic cameras and the cellular towers. Carter confirmed that Pierce was driving recklessly across town, heading straight back to the Azure Crest Resort. Pierce was a man drowning in terror, and he was rushing back to the woman who convinced him to jump into the deep water in the first place. Carter quickly accessed the internal security network of the resort. We could not see inside Valerie's penthouse suite, but Carter successfully hacked the microphone on Valerie's mobile phone. I could hear everything happening in the room with crystal clarity. 10 minutes later, the heavy wooden door of the suite slammed open. Pierce burst into the room. He was hyperventilating. His expensive tailored suit was ruined by mud and construction dust. Valerie sounded annoyed. She told him he was ruining the carpet and ordered him to calm down. Pierce ignored her arrogant commands. He began screaming. He told Valerie that the police found the explosives exactly where he dumped them. He told her the bomb squad was tearing his property apart, and that he was the primary suspect in an active terrorism investigation. Valerie tried to maintain her superior attitude. She told him he was overreacting. She insisted the police had no direct physical evidence tying the canisters to my basement. She told him to just deny everything and wait for the situation to blow over. She truly believed her own intelligence could outsmart a dedicated law enforcement investigation. Pierce was completely beyond the reach of her manipulation. He knew his financial records were a disaster. He knew that as soon as the police pulled his bank statements, they would see he was a desperate, bankrupt man capable of doing terrible things for money. He told Valerie he needed the absolute best criminal defense attorney in the state on a permanent retainer before the sun went down. He demanded an immediate cash advance on the life insurance money she had promised him. He told her to wire $500,000 into his personal checking account right this very second. Valerie scoffed at his panicked tone. She told him he was acting like a frightened child. But Pierce stepped closer to her. His voice dropped to a vicious growl. He explicitly threatened her. He swore that if she did not send the money immediately, he would march straight back to the police precinct and confess everything. He promised to tell the detectives exactly who hired him to blow up the house. Valerie realized he was entirely serious. The threat of prison finally cracked her calm exterior. I listened to the rapid clicking of her laptop keyboard. She told Pierce she would send the money just to stop his hysterical whining. She confidently navigated to our shared wealth management banking portal. This was the digital vault where she believed my massive fortune rested. She expected to log in and see millions of dollars waiting at her disposal. She asked Pierce for his routing number. She typed it into the transfer window. I sat in the dim motel room feeling a deep wave of cold satisfaction wash over me. She moved her cursor and confidently clicked the button to initiate the massive wire transfer. A loud, harsh error chime echoed through her computer speakers. The sound was perfectly clear through the phone tap. Valerie let out a small, confused gasp. She muttered under her breath and clicked the button a second time. The same aggressive error chime rang out. Pierce demanded to know what was taking so long. Valerie read the screen aloud, and her voice began to tremble. A stark, bright red error message was flashing aggressively across her high-resolution display. The system notified her that the transaction was completely denied. The text on the screen stated that the entire account was currently locked and frozen due to a suspected massive identity theft event. I heard her frantically clicking the trackpad. She backed out of the wire transfer screen and navigated to the main financial dashboard. Every single joint account we shared was displaying a locked status. The primary checking accounts were frozen. The high-yield savings accounts were inaccessible. The massive investment portfolios showed zero available balance for withdrawal. Even her platinum emergency credit lines were completely suspended. Carter had executed my absolute financial lockdown with flawless digital precision. Valerie slammed the laptop shut. The loud crack of the closing screen echoed in the room. Her breathing became just as heavy and erratic as Pierce's breathing. The unlimited funding she had blindly relied upon to execute her lethal plot had vanished instantly into thin air. She was a woman who defined her entire existence by her ability to purchase whatever she desired. Now she could not even buy a cup of coffee. Pierce began to yell again, demanding to know where the money was. Valerie screamed back at him that the accounts were locked. They were two cornered rats trapped in a luxurious cage, suddenly realizing the cheese they were promised was entirely gone. They had no money, no escape plan, and the police were actively circling their sinking ship. I simply closed my eyes and listened to their alliance violently collapse under the weight of their own greed. I sat perfectly still in the dim light of the motel room, listening to the heavy silence that followed Valerie realizing her accounts were frozen. The tension in her luxury hotel suite was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then a sharp electronic ringing pierced the quiet. It was the customized ringtone of Pierce's mobile phone. I did not need to guess who was calling him. I knew the exact identity of the caller because I was the one who orchestrated the timing of this specific conversation. The caller was the senior vice president of the commercial lending division at the private equity firm in Chicago. This was the massive firm I now secretly controlled after purchasing Pierce's debt portfolio earlier this morning. I had instructed the executive to wait until the police bomb squad officially locked down the construction site before making this crucial call. Pierce answered the phone. His voice was shaky and entirely devoid of its usual arrogant swagger. He tried to offer a polite corporate greeting, but the executive on the other end of the line did not entertain any pleasantries. The executive spoke in a cold, clinical monotone that carried absolute authority. He informed Pierce that the firm's advanced risk management software had just flagged a massive law enforcement presence at his primary commercial property. The executive stated clearly that active felony investigations involving industrial explosives and potential terrorism charges constituted a severe and immediate violation of the standard morality and risk covenants embedded deep within his primary lending contract. I listened through this high-definition audio feed as Pierce frantically tried to save his crumbling empire. He stammered and lied, claiming the police presence was just a simple misunderstanding over some discarded construction equipment. He promised the entire situation would be completely resolved by the end of the afternoon. The executive simply cut him off mid-sentence. He stated that the firm had zero tolerance for criminal exposure and was officially calling in the massive $5 million commercial loan effective immediately. Pierce stopped breathing. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. Then Pierce began to beg. He pleaded for a small extension or a renegotiation of the terms. The executive coldly informed him that he had exactly 24 hours to wire the full $5 million cash balance into the corporate holding account. If the funds did not arrive by tomorrow, the firm would immediately seize every single piece of commercial and private property Pierce owned and force him into catastrophic bankruptcy. The call abruptly disconnected. A hollow dial tone echoed out of the phone speaker and filled the hotel suite. The reality of his absolute financial ruin hit Pierce like a physical blow. He dropped his expensive phone onto the hardwood floor. The microphone on his smartwatch picked up every single sound with terrifying clarity. Carter had exploited a known security vulnerability in the Bluetooth connection of the watch earlier in the day, turning the device into a perfect covert listening tool. I could hear the heavy, rapid sound of Pierce's footsteps moving aggressively across the carpeted floor. He did not yell or scream this time. He moved with a terrifying, silent desperation that was far more dangerous than loud anger. I heard a sudden, sharp gasp from Valerie. It was followed immediately by the sickening sound of her body hitting the heavy drywall of the suite. Pierce had crossed the room in 3 strides and grabbed my wife by the throat. I sat frozen in the uncomfortable wooden chair, listening to the violent struggle unfold miles away. Valerie clawed frantically at his strong hands, gasping desperately for air. I heard her expensive diamond bracelets rattling against the wall as she fought to breathe. Pierce pinned her there, his voice dropping to a dark, menacing whisper that made my blood run cold. He told her she had ruined his entire life. He demanded his money. He demanded the millions of dollars she had promised him when she convinced him to crawl into my dark basement with a heavy explosive device. He squeezed her throat tighter. I could hear Valerie choking and sputtering. The glamorous, sophisticated facade she wore for the high society luncheons was completely gone. She was no longer the arrogant mastermind manipulating the men around her. She was just a terrified woman realizing the dangerous animal she tried to control had finally turned its teeth on her. Their toxic romantic alliance, built entirely on a foundation of greed, arrogance, and betrayal, shattered completely under the immediate crushing pressure of poverty. Pierce told her he absolutely refused to go to a federal prison for a woman who could not even afford to pay for a decent criminal defense attorney. He swore to her that he would march straight down to the downtown police precinct right now with the forged medical documents and his personal cell phone. He told her he had saved every single text message detailing their entire assassination plot, including her instructions on how to bypass my home security system. He promised to hand her over to the federal detectives on a silver platter in exchange for full prosecutorial immunity. He finally let go of her throat, letting her slide down the wall and collapse onto the floor. She coughed violently, taking in huge, gasping breaths of oxygen. Valerie was entirely backed into a dark corner. She had no digital funds available to appease him. She had no powerful allies left to protect her. She needed to quickly pacify the desperate, violent man standing over her before he completely destroyed them both. She crawled across the expensive carpet and grabbed the fabric of his pant leg. She cried out, promising him that she had a backup plan. She frantically confessed a massive secret she had kept completely hidden from me for the entire duration of our marriage. She told Pierce she had a private physical emergency asset stash stored in a highly secure underground deposit box at a private downtown bank. She promised the steel box contained over $2 million in untraceable foreign currency and high-grade uncut diamonds. She rapidly explained how she had been slowly siphoning my wealth for years, converting cash into untraceable stones, using fake charity donations, and vastly overstated renovation invoices. She had built a secret fortune for a moment, exactly like this. Pierce demanded she go to the bank right that very second and retrieve the assets. Valerie coughed and explained that the private vault was already closed for the day. She told him the high-security underground facility utilized a strict time lock mechanism that could only be accessed during specific morning banking hours. She swore on her own life she would be the very first person standing at the heavy steel vault doors when they finally opened tomorrow morning. She promised to empty every single diamond and every stack of currency into a duffel bag and hand it directly to him. She promised he would have the funds to pay off his massive called loan and flee the country before the police could process the evidence against him. Pierce stood over her, breathing heavily into the microphone of his watch. He accepted her desperate promise because he had absolutely no other choice left in the world. He told her if she did not produce the diamonds by tomorrow noon, he would kill her himself before the police could ever arrest him. I listened to him turn around and storm out of the suite, slamming the heavy wooden door behind him. Valerie was left alone on the floor, sobbing into the silence. I sat back in my chair, feeling a cold, tight smile form on my face. Valerie thought her secret underground vault was her ultimate salvation. She had absolutely no idea that I had already visited that exact bank. The morning sun climbed higher over the city skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the wet streets. Valerie did not wait for the valet at the luxury resort. She marched out of the grand lobby with her designer sunglasses pushed firmly against her face to hide her swollen eyes. She climbed into her luxury sedan and gripped the leather steering wheel with trembling hands. She drove erratically toward the downtown financial district. Her mind was entirely focused on the underground vault at the commercial bank. She believed that heavy steel box was her ultimate salvation. She was convinced that the uncut diamonds resting in the dark would buy her a one-way ticket out of the massive collapsing trap she had built for herself. She parked her vehicle illegally in front of the massive stone pillars of the bank building. She did not care about the parking violation. She only cared about getting her hands on the millions of dollars she desperately needed to pacify Pierce and flee the jurisdiction. The heavy brass doors of the bank swung open precisely at 9 in the morning. Valerie was the very first customer to step onto the polished marble floor. She walked past the row of regular tellers with an air of desperate entitlement. She demanded to see the senior vault manager immediately. The vault manager was a meticulously dressed man who recognized her instantly as one of their most exclusive clients. He offered her a polite smile and asked if she needed assistance. Valerie did not return the pleasantries. She simply pulled a long silver key from her designer handbag and demanded immediate access to the subterranean deposit boxes. The manager nodded and led her toward the heavy, secure elevator. The doors closed silently, separating them from the busy morning chatter of the main lobby. The elevator descended deep into the bedrock beneath the city streets. Valerie tapped her expensive heels impatiently against the floor. She rehearsed her escape plan in her mind over and over again. She would take the diamonds directly to an underground jeweler Pierce knew on the east side of the city. She would convert the stones into untraceable offshore currency by noon. She would hand Pierce his share to pay off his massive called loan, and then she would board a private charter flight, leaving the country forever. She believed her nightmare was just hours away from ending. The elevator came to a smooth halt, and the doors opened to reveal the thick, reinforced steel gate of the primary vault. The air inside the vault was incredibly cold and smelled faintly of oiled metal and old paper. The manager unlocked the primary gate and guided her down the long corridor lined with thousands of identical steel boxes. They arrived at her designated box near the very back of the secure room. It was a massive, double-wide container designed specifically for holding substantial physical wealth. Valerie stepped forward and inserted her long silver key into the right side of the dual lock mechanism. The manager inserted the master bank key into the left side. They turned their keys simultaneously. A heavy mechanical click echoed through the silent concrete room. The manager politely stepped away and turned his back to offer her absolute privacy. Valerie placed her trembling hands on the cold metal surface of the container. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, feeling a massive wave of premature relief wash over her body. She genuinely believed she had outsmarted everyone. She believed she had successfully stolen my hard-earned wealth and secured her perfect, glamorous future. She pulled the heavy steel drawer out from the wall and flipped open the internal metal lid. Valerie looked down into the deep container, expecting to see the brilliant sparkle of $2 million in high-grade uncut diamonds. She expected to see thick stacks of crisp $100 bills she had secretly siphoned from our accounts over the years. Instead, her eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated horror. The massive container was entirely empty, except for a single solitary object resting perfectly in the center of the cold steel floor. It was not a diamond, and it was not money. It was a small rectangular plastic device with a short tactical antenna protruding from the top. It was the exact remote detonator her hired assassins had planned to use to ignite the primary gas line in my basement. Valerie stopped breathing. The air in the underground vault suddenly felt so thick she could not pull it into her lungs. She reached out with a shaking hand and touched the cold plastic casing of the detonator. She recognized the device instantly because she was the one who originally paid Pierce to procure it from his dangerous underground contacts months in advance. She had absolutely no idea how the device got inside the secure vault. But I knew exactly how it got there. Yesterday afternoon, while Valerie was busy packing her designer luggage for her fake business trip to Seattle, I had paid a quiet visit to my own basement. I found the remote detonator Pierce had prematurely hidden behind the furnace in preparation for his late-night sabotage. I took the device and drove directly to the downtown bank. I possessed the primary master key to that specific deposit box because I was the one who originally opened the account decades ago. I knew Valerie had been secretly hoarding physical assets inside the box for years. I simply allowed her to build the emergency fund because I knew I could take it away the moment she crossed the line. I emptied every single diamond and every single dollar bill into my own leather briefcase. I placed the useless plastic detonator inside the empty steel box and locked it tight. I wanted to leave her a very clear and unmistakable message. Valerie stared at the useless plastic device resting in the empty metal box. The walls of the underground vault seemed to physically close in on her. Her perfect, glamorous facade violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She finally understood the absolute terrifying truth. The old man she thought was suffering from severe dementia had outsmarted her at every single turn. She realized I was not dead in a tragic house fire. She realized my mind was not failing in the slightest. She realized I had discovered her entire lethal conspiracy long before she even put it into motion. The frozen bank accounts, the sudden massive foreclosure on her secret lover, and the missing diamonds were not terrible coincidences. They were calculated precision strikes. I was actively hunting her, and I had systematically stripped away every single weapon she possessed. She had walked straight into a masterfully designed cage, and the heavy steel door had just slammed shut behind her. She fell to her knees right there on the cold marble floor of the massive bank vault, completely broken and entirely consumed by the crushing weight of her own absolute destruction. Valerie stumbled out of the heavy brass doors of the downtown financial institution and into the blinding light of the morning sun. The realization that her secret vault was entirely empty had shattered her perfect composure. She walked unsteadily toward her illegally parked luxury sedan, gripping her designer purse so tightly, her knuckles turned completely white. She sat in the driver's seat and stared blankly at the steering wheel. She had no diamonds to sell. She had no hidden stacks of cash. Pierce was currently waiting at the hotel, expecting a massive payout by noon. He had promised to physically harm her if she failed to deliver the money he needed to escape his massive foreclosed loan. Valerie was entirely trapped. She could not simply run away because she had no available funds to buy a plane ticket or secure a new identity. She had only one desperate card left to play in her twisted game. She needed my massive life insurance policy to pay out immediately. But corporate insurance companies do not write $20 million checks just because a wife claims her husband drove off a steep cliff during a storm. They require absolute proof of death. They require a physical body, or they require a definitive legal declaration from a high-ranking law enforcement official stating that the victim is undeniably deceased. Desperation completely erased whatever cautious instincts Valerie had left. She pulled out her mobile phone and dialed a number she had sworn to only use in absolute emergencies. The number belonged to a senior vice detective in the local police department. I knew about this specific detective because I had seen his name buried deep within the financial ledgers Carter recovered earlier. Over the past 3 years, Valerie had acted as the quiet bag woman for Pierce. She had personally delivered thick envelopes of untraceable cash to this detective in dark parking lots. The bribes were meant to ensure the local police ignored the severe zoning violations and structural safety hazards at Pierce's various commercial construction sites. The detective was a greedy and corrupt man who viewed his gold badge as a license to print his own money. Valerie knew he was morally bankrupt, and right now she desperately needed a criminal with a badge to save her life. Valerie arranged to meet him at a deserted municipal park on the edge of the industrial district. Carter tracked her vehicle via the city traffic cameras and intercepted the cellular signal of her phone. I sat in the dim motel room and listened intently as Carter patched the live audio feed directly into my laptop speakers. The audio was incredibly crisp. I heard the loud crunch of gravel as the detective parked his unmarked cruiser next to her sedan. He got out of his car and climbed heavily into the passenger seat of her vehicle. He complained about the early hour and demanded to know why she was calling him on his private, unlisted line. Valerie did not waste any time with pleasantries. Her voice was shaking, but she pushed through the rising panic. She told him the police were currently searching the surrounding forests and rivers for my missing vehicle. She told the detective she needed him to step in and take absolute control of that specific investigation. She needed him to formally declare that my vehicle had been swept away in the violent river currents during the heavy rainstorm last night. She needed him to sign an official police report stating that my death was an absolute certainty, even without recovering a physical body. The detective laughed at her. It was a cold and mocking sound that echoed through the small cabin of the car. He told her she was completely out of her mind. He explained that fabricating a fatal accident report involving a prominent, wealthy citizen was a massive federal crime that would draw intense media scrutiny. He reached for the door handle to leave. Valerie panicked and grabbed his arm. She played her absolute final card. She offered him a bribe so massive it would guarantee his early and luxurious retirement. She offered him the deed to my private vacation home. It was a beautiful, sprawling log cabin located on a pristine lake up in the northern mountains. I had built that cabin with my own hands. I took Leo fishing on that lake every summer. The property was worth over $3 million. Valerie promised to quietly transfer the deed into the name of his anonymous shell corporation by the end of the week, if he just signed the official death declaration today. She was offering to trade my most cherished family sanctuary for a forged piece of paper that would declare me dead. The heavy silence in the car stretched for a very long time. The detective was silently weighing the severe risk against the incredible reward. Greed is a highly predictable poison, and this man was deeply addicted to it. The detective slowly took his hand off the door handle. He asked her if the mountain property was completely paid off. Valerie eagerly confirmed that there was no mortgage and the property taxes were fully paid for the next 10 years. The detective agreed to the dirty deal. He promised to manipulate the search grid and falsify the river recovery reports before his shift ended at 5 o'clock that evening. He told her to have the property transfer documents ready for his signature by tomorrow morning. He got out of her car and drove away entirely unaware that he had just signed his own professional and literal death warrant. I sat in the uncomfortable wooden chair, feeling a deep sense of cold satisfaction. I looked at the audio file recording processing on my screen. I had the corrupt detective caught dead to rights on a crystal-clear digital recording. He had explicitly agreed to falsify a death report in exchange for a multi-million-dollar real estate bribe. But I knew I could not send this audio file to the local police precinct. The local police department was a tight brotherhood. If I sent the evidence to his commanding officers, they might try to bury the file to protect the public reputation of their precinct. They might quietly tip him off, allowing him to destroy evidence and cover his tracks before internal affairs could intervene. I needed a much higher authority. I needed a hammer so heavy that the local police could not possibly stop it from falling. I told Carter to bypass the local authorities entirely. Carter had extensive high-level contacts within the Federal Bureau of Investigation from his previous days as a forensic auditor. He specifically knew the lead agent in charge of the Regional Public Corruption Task Force. This was a specialized unit dedicated solely to hunting down dirty cops and corrupt local politicians. Carter securely packaged the audio recording of the park bribe. He also attached the digital metadata showing Valerie illegally accessing the property deed portal earlier that morning to prepare the fraudulent transfer. He sent the entire encrypted file directly to the personal secure terminal of the lead federal agent. We did not have to wait long for a response. The federal government moves incredibly fast when a corrupt law enforcement officer is handed to them on a silver platter with undeniable physical evidence. Within 20 minutes, Carter received a secure encrypted message confirming the receipt of the files. The federal agents authenticated the voice of the detective using their databases and verified the property records. They recognized the extreme urgency of the situation because the detective was actively planning to tamper with an ongoing and highly publicized missing persons investigation. They could not allow him to corrupt the case files and ruin the integrity of the search. Exactly 2 hours after Valerie made her desperate deal in the cold municipal park, the federal judge signed an expedited high-risk arrest warrant. The warrant charged the vice detective with severe extortion, bribery, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The local police department had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. The federal agents did not notify the local precinct of their intentions. They organized a rapid tactical strike team to apprehend the detective before he could even begin to alter my missing persons file. Meanwhile, Valerie drove back to the luxury resort, believing she had just bought her way out of the nightmare. She thought the death certificate was guaranteed. She thought the massive insurance payout was finally within her grasp. She had absolutely no idea that her desperate attempt to manipulate the law had just brought the full crushing weight of the federal government directly down upon her. The federal government operates with terrifying efficiency when they are handed absolute digital proof of corruption within their own law enforcement community. The regional director of the Public Corruption Task Force did not wait for the local police chief to return from his afternoon lunch break. He dispatched a heavily armed tactical unit directly to the central precinct the moment the federal judge signed the arrest warrant. I sat in my quiet room with my sleeping son nearby, listening to the encrypted federal radio channels as the operation commenced. The corrupt vice detective was likely sitting comfortably at his desk, filling out the fraudulent paperwork that would officially declare me dead without a body. He was probably daydreaming about the beautiful mountain cabin he believed he had just successfully stolen from my family. He had absolutely no idea his entire corrupt world was about to violently collapse around him. The heavy glass doors of the local police precinct swung open with sudden aggressive force. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical vests swept into the building. They completely bypassed the confused officers at the front desk and marched straight into the active bullpen. The local police officers froze in their tracks. The lead federal agent approached the vice detective and loudly ordered him to stand up and place his hands flat on his metal desk. The detective tried to argue and play the role of the indignant, seasoned cop. He tried to pull rank and demand professional courtesy from his fellow law enforcement officers. The federal agents did not humor his arrogant demands. They forcefully shoved him against his desk and secured his wrists in heavy steel handcuffs. They stripped him of his gold badge and confiscated his loaded service weapon right in front of his entire department. The public humiliation was absolute and irreversible. Every single local officer watched in stunned silence as the corrupt detective was dragged out of the precinct in total disgrace. The agents did not take him to a local holding cell where his friends could protect him. They transported him directly to the heavily fortified federal building in the center of the downtown district. They placed him in a cold, windowless interrogation room and left him completely alone for an hour. They wanted the crushing reality of his situation to sink deep into his mind. When the lead agent finally walked into the small room, he did not ask any probing questions. He simply opened a thick manila folder and placed a small digital audio player on the metal table. He pressed a single button and played the crystal-clear audio file of the conversation that took place in the municipal park just a few hours earlier. The detective sat frozen as he heard his own voice greedily accepting the deed to my mountain property in exchange for falsifying a fatal accident report. The blood completely drained from his face as the recording ended. The federal agent then presented the digital metadata showing the illegal property transfer Valerie had attempted to initiate online. The agent calmly outlined the exact charges the detective was currently facing. The massive list included federal racketeering, severe extortion, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder for financial gain. The agent explained that the detective was looking at a minimum of 30 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary where former police officers rarely survive. The only way to reduce that massive sentence was absolute and immediate cooperation. Corrupt men possess no genuine loyalty to anyone but themselves. They only care about their own survival when the walls close in on them. The detective broke instantly under the crushing weight of the undeniable evidence. He did not even ask for a lawyer to be present. He immediately accepted a comprehensive plea deal to save his own life. The detective began speaking, and he did not stop for 2 straight hours. He detailed every single illegal transaction he had ever conducted with Valerie and Pierce over the past 3 years. He confessed to accepting thick envelopes of untraceable cash, to deliberately ignore the severe structural violations at the commercial construction sites owned by Pierce. He then outlined the entire current assassination plot in terrifying detail. He told the federal agents exactly how Valerie planned to use the forged medical documents to declare me mentally incompetent. He explained her desperate attempt to fabricate my accidental death in the rushing river to trigger the massive $20 million life insurance payout. He handed the federal investigators the complete operational blueprint of their lethal conspiracy. The federal judge who reviewed the explosive recorded confession immediately issued high-priority federal arrest warrants for both Valerie and Pierce. They were no longer simply persons of interest in a localized missing persons case. They were now considered highly dangerous federal fugitives actively fleeing from a massive financial and physical conspiracy. The Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately coordinated with local news stations to broadcast the active warrants across every major television channel in the state. The net was cast incredibly wide, and there was no escaping it. While the federal net was rapidly closing around her, Valerie was experiencing her own private nightmare. After finding the underground bank vault completely empty, she knew she could never return to the luxurious Azure Crest Resort. She had no money to pay the massive hotel bill, and her credit lines were entirely frozen. More importantly, she knew Pierce was waiting for her in that penthouse suite, expecting a heavy bag full of uncut diamonds. Pierce had explicitly threatened to physically destroy her if she returned empty-handed. She was a woman accustomed to endless luxury and absolute security, but she was suddenly reduced to a terrified animal running for her life. She drove her luxury sedan to a shady pawn shop on the ragged edge of the city. She took off her expensive diamond wedding ring and her platinum designer watch. She traded the pristine symbols of our broken marriage for a few $100s in crumpled cash. She used that dirty cash to rent a room at a dilapidated roadside motel far away from the wealthy gated neighborhoods she usually frequented. The room was filthy and smelled strongly of cheap bleach and old cigarette smoke. She locked the flimsy wooden door and collapsed onto the sagging mattress. She was completely exhausted and entirely broken by the events of the morning. She picked up the sticky plastic remote control and turned on the small television resting on the scratched wooden dresser. She desperately hoped to see the local news reporting that my body had been officially found in the river, just as she had paid the corrupt detective to arrange. She needed to know that at least one tiny part of her master plan had actually worked. The regular daytime programming suddenly stopped. A breaking news graphic flashed across the screen, accompanied by a loud emergency broadcast tone. The local news anchor appeared looking incredibly serious and tense. The anchor announced that a massive federal manhunt was currently underway across the city. The screen cut away from the anchor and displayed two large photographs side by side. One photograph belonged to Pierce. The other photograph was a glamorous, high-resolution image of Valerie. It was the exact same photograph she had proudly used for her exclusive country club membership profile just a month ago. The anchor read the official statement directly from the federal task force. The reporter announced that the grieving widow, who had just hours earlier pleaded on national television for the safe return of her husband, was actually the primary mastermind behind a massive assassination and insurance fraud conspiracy. The news broadcast detailed the severe federal charges and warned the public that both suspects were considered desperate and highly dangerous. Valerie sat on the edge of the dirty motel bed, entirely paralyzed by absolute terror. She watched her own beautiful face flash repeatedly on the small television screen. In a matter of seconds, her public identity had violently shifted. She was no longer the tragic, wealthy victim searching for her lost family. She was a wanted fugitive being hunted by the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country. She looked around the miserable, cheap motel room, realizing this was the direct and unavoidable result of her own endless greed. She had tried to steal my massive fortune and build a perfect, glamorous life built entirely on lies and murder. Instead, she had systematically destroyed every single privilege she ever possessed. She had no money, no powerful allies, no pristine reputation, and absolutely no place left to hide. The faint sound of approaching police sirens began to echo through the thin walls of the motel room. Valerie curled her knees to her chest and began to sob uncontrollably into the silence. The heavy dominoes I had carefully lined up were finally falling, and they were crushing her completely. Valerie could not stay in that filthy motel room for another second. The walls felt like they were closing in on her, and the sound of the approaching sirens in the distance pushed her into a state of absolute blind panic. She grabbed her designer purse and the few $100s she had scraped together from the shady pawn shop. She rushed out of the cheap room and sprinted across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. The luxury sedan she had been driving all morning was parked right outside the door. This was the same beautiful vehicle she used to flee the downtown bank and abandon Pierce at the resort. She slid into the comfortable driver's seat and pushed the ignition button. The powerful engine roared to life, wrapping her in a false sense of security. She believed this expensive machine was going to be her ultimate salvation. She quickly pulled out of the parking lot and mapped out a desperate route in her mind. She knew she had to avoid the major city toll booths, where the police traffic cameras would instantly scan her license plate. Her new destination was a small private airfield located just across the northern state border. She knew a disgraced charter pilot there who asked absolutely no questions if you handed him a thick stack of untraceable cash. She calculated that she had just enough money to bribe him for a short flight across the border into international territory where the federal agents could never touch her. She merged onto the desolate stretch of the interstate, leaving the chaotic city limits far behind. The heavy rain from yesterday had dried up, leaving a bleak and overcast afternoon sky. The further she drove from the downtown financial district, the more her panic began to slowly subside. The soft leather seats wrapped comfortably around her, and the soundproof cabin completely blocked out the noise of the rushing wind. She looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror, using her fingers to fix her messy hair and wipe the smeared mascara from her cheeks. She actually started to convince herself that she was far too smart to be caught by the authorities. She told herself that the federal agents were currently busy raiding Pierce and interrogating the corrupt vice detective. She assumed she had a massive head start and that no one was actively looking for her on this specific highway. She pressed her expensive shoe down on the accelerator, pushing the luxury sedan to 80 miles an hour. She felt like she was flying away from the disastrous consequences of her own terrible actions. What Valerie completely failed to comprehend was the true origin of the very vehicle she was currently driving. She had always believed Pierce bought her that expensive sedan as a deeply romantic gift to celebrate their secret anniversary last year. She thought the car was entirely registered under his commercial real estate firm, making it completely untraceable to her own name. That was just another carefully constructed lie I had allowed her to believe. In reality, Pierce was already drowning in massive debt back then and could not afford a bicycle, let alone a $100,000 imported car. I was the actual person who quietly purchased that exact vehicle under a corporate lease through my primary engineering firm. I structured the complex financial paperwork so the dealership would hand the keys directly to Pierce, allowing him to play the role of the wealthy, generous lover. I did this because I wanted absolute total surveillance over the woman who was sleeping in my bed while actively plotting my murder. Because I owned the corporate lease, I also held the master administrative access to the advanced satellite diagnostic system built deep into the computer brain of the car. I sat at the small laminate desk in my dim motel room, listening to the quiet and steady breathing of my son. I closed the encrypted police scanner application on my laptop and opened a specialized software program provided directly by the vehicle manufacturer. I typed in my executive corporate credentials. A high-resolution satellite map of the state immediately appeared on my screen. A small, pulsing red dot was moving rapidly down the interstate, heading directly toward the northern border. It was Valerie. The administrative system provided me with a terrifying amount of real-time data. I could see her exact speed on the highway. I could see the remaining fuel levels in the tank. I could even see the ambient temperature she had set inside the luxury cabin. She was currently driving through the absolute most desolate stretch of the northern interstate. It is a massive expanse of empty road surrounded by dense pine forests and jagged rocky hills. There are no gas stations, no rest stops, and absolutely no exits for over 40 miles. It was the absolute perfect place to spring the final trap. I watched the red dot cross the 50-mile marker, proving she was completely isolated from any form of civilization. I placed my fingers over the keyboard, taking a slow, deep breath. I did not want her to crash the car and potentially hurt an innocent driver on the road. I wanted a slow, agonizing realization of total defeat. I selected the remote engine management tab on my computer screen. I clicked the digital command to gradually restrict the fuel injection system. Miles away on the lonely highway, Valerie suddenly felt the powerful engine begin to stutter and choke. The luxury sedan jerked violently forward, and the digital dashboard flashed a series of confusing warning lights. She frantically pumped the gas pedal, but the car completely refused to accelerate. Her speed steadily dropped from 80 miles an hour down to 50 and then down to 20. Absolute panic seized her chest as she wrestled the heavy steering wheel, guiding the dying vehicle onto the loose gravel shoulder of the highway. The expensive car finally rolled to a complete and silent stop. Valerie cursed loudly, hitting the steering wheel with her open palms. She assumed the car had simply suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure at the worst possible moment. She reached for the interior door handle, intending to step out into the cold afternoon air and flag down a passing truck for a ride. That is the exact moment I initiated the second phase of the absolute lockdown. I typed a master override command into my laptop. I engaged the heavy electronic deadlocks on all 4 doors simultaneously. A loud, heavy click echoed through the quiet cabin of her car. Valerie pulled the silver handle again, but the door completely refused to budge. She leaned over and tried the passenger side door, but it was locked incredibly tight. She frantically pushed the manual unlock buttons on the center console. The buttons were completely dead and unresponsive. I had remotely severed the digital connection between the cabin controls and the physical locking mechanisms in the doors. I then executed a command to roll up the tinted windows tightly and permanently disable the internal window motors. Valerie was suddenly trapped inside a soundproof, airtight cage of reinforced glass and high-grade steel. She beat her small fists against the thick passenger windows, screaming for help, but there was absolutely no one around to hear her. The highway outside was completely empty and silent. The digital navigation screen on her dashboard suddenly flickered and the map disappeared. I used the administrative messaging feature to send a single line of text directly to her display screen. The message simply read, "You are not going anywhere, Valerie." She stopped hitting the glass and stared at the glowing white letters in the center of her dashboard. The very last shred of her sanity completely evaporated into the cold air. She finally realized that the luxury car was never a loving gift from Pierce. She realized I had been pulling every single string from the very beginning of her escape. She was not a clever criminal mastermind riding off into the sunset. She was just a captured rat sitting helplessly in a high-tech trap waiting for the federal authorities to arrive. She curled her knees to her chest in the expensive leather driver's seat and simply waited for her inevitable end. I watched the small red dot blinking rhythmically on my computer monitor. The luxury sedan was completely immobilized on the gravel shoulder of the northern interstate, exactly where I had calculated it would stop. Valerie was now locked inside a high-strength steel cage of her own making. I did not want her to simply sit there and panic in the quiet woods until a random passing motorist decided to stop and help her. I wanted the full, crushing weight of the federal and state law enforcement agencies to come down upon her all at once. I picked up my untraceable prepaid cellular phone and dialed the emergency dispatch line for the State Highway Patrol. I did not use my real name, and I did not bother utilizing the digital voice-altering software this time. I spoke with the calm and steady authority of a concerned civilian, reporting a highly suspicious abandoned vehicle on a remote stretch of the highway. I gave the emergency dispatcher the exact longitudinal and latitudinal coordinates pulled directly from my satellite tracking software. I then casually mentioned that the license plate on the stalled vehicle perfectly matched the luxury car belonging to the high-profile federal fugitive currently dominating the local breaking news networks. The dispatcher gasped loudly and immediately placed me on a brief hold. I could hear the rapid aggressive clicking of a keyboard over the line as they frantically verified the registration information. When the dispatcher returned to the line, their voice was tight with pure adrenaline. They confirmed that multiple armed tactical units were already in the vicinity and were rapidly converging on that exact location from both directions of the interstate. I hung up the phone without another word and dropped it into the cheap plastic trash bin sitting next to the motel desk. Its purpose was entirely fulfilled, and I no longer needed a ghost phone. I opened a new internet browser tab on my computer and navigated directly to the primary news channel for our region. The local television stations had already caught wind of the massive police mobilization heading toward the northern border. A bright red breaking news banner crawled across the bottom of the screen. A local news helicopter was already up in the overcast sky following the speeding convoy of state trooper vehicles. I expanded the video player to fill my entire monitor. I wanted to see every single detail of her absolute downfall. I needed to witness the final chapter of her destruction with my own eyes. Just then, I heard a soft rustling sound from the other side of the room. I turned around in my wooden chair and saw my son Leo sitting up in the narrow motel bed. He rubbed his sleepy eyes and looked around the unfamiliar dim room. He did not look scared or anxious. He looked at me with absolute total trust and a gentle smile. I smiled back at him and promised in a soft voice that we were completely safe now. I walked over to the small kitchenette area and opened a cardboard box of microwave pancakes I had purchased from the motel lobby vending machine earlier that morning. I placed the food on a paper plate and heated them up until they were warm. I poured a small glass of cold orange juice and brought the simple breakfast over to the small laminate table. Leo climbed out of bed and sat down happily, pouring thick, sweet maple syrup over his food. He was completely insulated from the dark and violent reality unfolding just a few miles away. I sat back down in my chair and focused my attention entirely on the glowing monitor. The high-definition camera mounted on the news helicopter zoomed in tightly on the desolate stretch of the highway. There it was. The expensive luxury sedan was parked awkwardly on the loose gravel shoulder, exactly where I had disabled the powerful engine. The dense, dark pine trees cast long shadows over the immobilized vehicle, making it look incredibly small and vulnerable. Suddenly, a massive fleet of state highway patrol cruisers roared into the camera frame. 4 heavily marked police interceptors swerved aggressively onto the gravel shoulder, completely boxing in the sedan from all possible angles. The flashing red and blue emergency lights illuminated the dark forest, creating a chaotic and terrifying scene. Heavily armed police officers jumped out of their vehicles the moment they shifted into park. They immediately drew their service weapons. They took defensive tactical positions behind their open, heavy car doors, aiming their rifles and handguns directly at the dark-tinted windows of the luxury sedan. The lead officer grabbed a heavy megaphone from his cruiser and ordered the driver to turn off the engine and step out of the vehicle with her hands raised high in the air. Of course, the engine was already completely dead, and the heavy electronic deadlocks I had remotely engaged made it physically impossible for Valerie to comply with their strict demands, even if she desperately wanted to surrender. The helicopter camera angled slightly, allowing a partial view through the front windshield of the sedan. I could clearly see Valerie inside the luxury cabin. She was thrashing around like a trapped wild animal, realizing the hunters had finally surrounded her. The thick, soundproof security glass completely muted her frantic screams, but her absolute terror was visibly undeniable on the live feed. She was slamming her open palms repeatedly against the reinforced side windows, trying to break the locking mechanisms. When that failed to work, she balled her hands into tight fists and began violently punching the thick safety glass. The reinforced security glass did not even crack under the pressure. She beat her fists against the window until her knuckles were deeply bruised and bleeding, leaving dark crimson smears against the expensive tinted surface. She was screaming words I could not hear, but I knew with absolute certainty she was begging for her life. She realized the heavily armed police officers outside had their weapons trained directly on her chest. The officers could not see her clearly through the dark window tint, and they had absolutely no idea the doors were permanently locked by a remote administrative server. They simply saw a desperate federal fugitive refusing to exit a vehicle during a high-risk traffic stop. The tension on the empty highway was escalating by the second. Valerie was currently experiencing the exact same absolute suffocating terror she had intended to inflict upon me and my young son in our dark basement. The lead officer slowly lowered his megaphone. He realized the suspect was not going to surrender peacefully, and they could not wait on the side of the road forever. He gave a sharp tactical hand signal to his squad. 2 officers wearing heavy ballistic helmets and thick tactical armor stepped out from behind the safety of their cruisers. They approached the passenger side of the luxury sedan, moving with careful, calculated precision. One of the officers retrieved a heavy steel breaching tool from his utility belt. He pulled his thick arm back and smashed the heavy metal tip directly into the bottom corner of the passenger window. The reinforced glass shattered instantly, sending thousands of tiny sharp fragments cascading into the expensive, pristine leather interior of the cabin. Valerie shrieked and scrambled toward the driver's side door, trying to escape the sudden violent intrusion, but there was nowhere left to hide. The second tactical officer reached his thick-gloved arm through the broken window and manually forced the internal locking mechanism open using a specialized bypass tool. The heavy car door finally swung open. The officers did not offer her a gentle or polite escort out of the vehicle. They reached inside, grabbed her firmly by the shoulders of her expensive designer jacket, and violently dragged her out of the car. She hit the cold, rough asphalt of the highway incredibly hard. Her expensive designer clothes were instantly covered in highway dirt and broken safety glass. 3 heavy officers instantly pinned her to the ground, pressing their knees firmly into her back to prevent any further struggle. They grabbed her bleeding hands and forced them roughly behind her back securing her wrists in thick, heavy steel handcuffs. The loud metallic clicking sound of the restraints was not audible through the helicopter feed, but my mind filled in the incredibly satisfying noise perfectly. The officers hauled her roughly to her feet, grabbing her by the arms. Her face was completely covered in tears and heavily smeared makeup. She looked absolutely pathetic and entirely defeated. She was no longer a wealthy, arrogant socialite plotting a multi-million-dollar murder to fund her extravagant lifestyle. She was just a broken common criminal facing decades in a maximum security federal prison. A state trooper stood directly in front of her, sternly reciting her Miranda rights, while the blinding police lights washed over her pale face. I watched the live high-definition stream as they pushed her head down and shoved her forcefully into the back of a waiting patrol cruiser. The heavy metal door slammed shut, sealing her miserable fate forever. I closed the laptop screen, allowing the quiet, absolute peace of the motel room to wash over me. I turned to look at Leo. He was happily chewing his last bite of pancake, completely focused on a small plastic toy he found in his pocket. He was entirely unaffected by the permanent removal of the monster who intended to kill him. Our long nightmare was finally over. The architect of our destruction was safely locked in a steel cage, and our world was suddenly a much brighter and safer place. While Valerie was experiencing her final moments of freedom trapped inside the immobilized luxury vehicle, miles away. On the northern highway, Pierce was fighting his own pathetic battle for survival deep within the city limits. He had stormed out of the Azure Crest Resort after violently confronting Valerie and realizing their entire financial safety net had completely vanished. He did not take the main elevators down to the grand lobby because he knew the federal authorities were likely already swarming the front desk. He scrambled down 30 flights of concrete emergency stairs. His lungs burned with exhaustion, and his expensive Italian leather shoes severely blistered his feet. He knew his bank accounts were heavily monitored. He knew his massive commercial loan was officially called in, and he had absolutely no way to pay it. He knew the local police bomb squad had already found his discarded explosives at his other property. He was a cornered animal, completely stripped of his arrogant fangs and running purely on blind terror. He could not use his own vehicle because the license plates would trigger the automated traffic cameras scattered across the city grid. He was forced to flee entirely on foot. He avoided the wide, affluent main streets and walked through the narrow, filthy alleys of the industrial district. This was a neglected part of the city he usually only viewed from the tinted windows of his chauffeured town car. Now he was stumbling through the damp trash and the broken glass like a common vagrant. His custom-tailored suit was completely soaked with nervous sweat and deeply stained with urban grime. He constantly looked over his shoulder, jumping at the sound of every passing siren and every barking dog. The crushing weight of his impending doom was physically destroying the confident posture he had spent decades perfecting. He headed toward his flagship commercial property, located on the absolute edge of the industrial zone. It was a massive, half-finished luxury high-rise that was supposed to permanently cement his legacy as a brilliant real estate developer. It was now nothing more than a giant concrete tombstone for his ruined career. He squeezed his bruised body through a narrow gap in the heavy chain-link fence. He navigated the muddy, uneven terrain and slipped into the cavernous concrete shadows of the unfinished subterranean parking garage. He desperately believed he could hide in the damp darkness until nightfall. He foolishly thought he could contact an old underground associate to smuggle him out of the state inside the back of a commercial freight truck. He found a discarded wooden shipping crate in the darkest corner of the concrete basement and collapsed onto the cold ground. He pulled his muddy knees to his chest, trembling violently in the quiet, damp air. He thought he was entirely alone. He thought he had successfully evaded the massive law enforcement net that was currently sweeping the city streets. He was completely and catastrophically wrong. Carter had never stopped tracking the constant digital signal emitting from the expensive smartwatch tightly strapped to his wrist. I had provided the exact geographical coordinates of the subterranean garage to the Federal Public Corruption Task Force hours before Pierce even arrived at the fence. The trap was already set and waiting in the absolute dark. The terrifying silence of the concrete basement was suddenly shattered by the blinding glare of high-intensity tactical flashlights. The brilliant white beams cut through the darkness from multiple angles, completely blinding him. Heavy military-grade boots echoed loudly and aggressively against the concrete floor. Pierce threw his muddy hands over his face, trying to shield his eyes from the painful light. A dozen federal agents wearing heavy tactical body armor had completely surrounded his isolated position. Their assault rifles were raised and pointed directly at his chest. The bright red dots of their laser sights painted a glowing target directly over his rapidly beating heart. The lead federal agent ordered him to stand up slowly and keep his hands entirely visible. Pierce scrambled unsteadily to his feet. He did not try to run because there was absolutely nowhere left to go. He did not try to fight because he was a coward who only preyed on those he believed were weak. His arrogant, untouchable facade crumbled instantly under the terrifying reality of the federal weapons pointed at him. He immediately raised his shaking hands high into the cold air. He decided to use the only survival strategy he had ever relied upon in his entire miserable life. He decided to lie and manipulate. He desperately tried to negotiate with the heavily armed federal agents. He spoke rapidly, his voice cracking with absolute pathetic panic. He told the agents they were making a terrible mistake. He claimed he was a respected businessman and completely innocent of any violent conspiracy. He threw Valerie under the bus without a single second of hesitation. He told the agents that Valerie was a manipulative sociopath who had entirely tricked him. He claimed she was the sole mastermind behind the plot to murder me and my son for the massive insurance payout. He painted himself as a naive romantic victim who was simply trying to help a terrified woman escape an allegedly abusive marriage. He begged the agents for immediate protective custody and eagerly offered to testify against her in federal court if they let him walk away. The lead agent did not lower his heavy weapon. He did not offer a single word of sympathy or professional understanding. He simply stared at the pathetic, trembling man standing in the mud. The agent slowly reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a standard digital audio player. He pressed a button and turned the volume up to the absolute maximum level. The clear, unmistakable voice of Pierce echoed loudly through the cavernous concrete basement. It was the exact audio recording Carter had captured through the hacked smartwatch just a few hours earlier inside the luxury hotel suite. The digital recording played the exact moment Pierce violently choked Valerie and threw her against the drywall. It played his vicious threats demanding his money. It played his explicit, arrogant admission that he was the one who physically procured the industrial explosives from his dangerous underground contacts. It proved beyond any shadow of a legal doubt that he was an active, willing, and incredibly violent participant in the calculated plot to murder an old man and an innocent child. Pierce listened to his own recorded voice condemning him to a lifetime in a maximum security prison. His mouth hung open in absolute shock. He looked down at the expensive smartwatch strapped to his wrist, finally realizing the incredibly expensive piece of technology was the very instrument of his total destruction. He realized he had been under constant and total surveillance. He realized the old man he intended to blow to pieces had actually engineered a flawless, invisible cage entirely around him. The lead agent clicked off the audio player and gave a short, sharp command to his tactical team. Two massive agents stepped forward and grabbed Pierce roughly by the arms. They slammed him forcefully against a cold concrete pillar, knocking the remaining breath from his lungs. They kicked his legs apart and patted him down for hidden weapons. They pulled his arms violently behind his back and secured his wrists with heavy industrial zip ties that cut deeply into his skin. They did not read him his rights politely. They shouted the massive list of federal charges while physically dragging his struggling body out of the dark basement and directly into the blinding afternoon light. A heavy armored transport van was waiting in the muddy clearing of the construction site, surrounded by federal cruisers. The agents tossed him roughly into the back of the steel-reinforced cabin. The heavy metal doors slammed shut with a final, echoing boom. Pierce was completely trapped in the suffocating darkness of the transport vehicle. His physical freedom was permanently erased in a matter of seconds. But his physical arrest was only a fraction of the total absolute punishment I had prepared for him. While he was sitting in the dark armored van being transported to the federal holding facility, I was busy finalizing the destruction of his entire professional legacy. I contacted Nolan at the private equity firm in Chicago. I authorized him to execute the absolute maximum penalty clauses deeply embedded within the $5 million commercial loan I had purchased that morning. The massive foreclosure was initiated with brutal corporate efficiency. By the time the afternoon financial markets closed, my anonymous proxy corporation had legally seized every single asset Pierce had ever owned. We seized the half-finished luxury high-rises. We seized the massive commercial shopping centers. We seized the expensive imported sports cars and the pristine downtown office spaces. The banks permanently froze his remaining personal accounts to cover the outstanding legal fees and massive corporate penalties. The local evening news broadcasts completely decimated whatever remaining shreds of his public reputation existed. The news anchors displayed his muddy, pathetic mugshot, alongside detailed high-resolution graphics, explaining his total financial bankruptcy and his central role in the violent federal assassination conspiracy. The wealthy elite society that once celebrated him immediately turned their backs and permanently erased his name from their directories. Pierce had spent his entire adult life stepping on vulnerable people to build a massive, glittering empire of concrete and glass. He woke up that morning believing he was a powerful predator entirely in control of his own golden destiny. He went to sleep that night on a thin plastic mattress in a freezing federal holding cell, entirely stripped of his freedom, his massive business empire, and his pristine public reputation simultaneously. I sat in the quiet motel room and watched the massive financial transfer confirmations roll across my laptop screen. I had not laid a single violent finger on him. I simply allowed his own reckless arrogance to dig a massive grave, and then I quietly pushed him directly into the dark dirt. The morning sun broke through the heavy gray clouds, casting a brilliant golden light over the city streets. I woke up early in the quiet motel room, feeling completely rested and entirely focused for the first time in several years. The heavy, suffocating burden of constantly looking over my shoulder was finally gone. I opened my leather travel bag and pulled out the bespoke charcoal suit I had packed specifically for this exact day. I dressed carefully and methodically, adjusting my silk tie and polishing my leather shoes until they shone perfectly. I woke Leo gently and helped him put on a small tailored navy blazer. I told him we were going to a very important building today to ensure the bad people could never bother us again. He looked up at me and held my hand tightly, completely trusting me to guide him. We left the cheap roadside motel room behind and climbed into a private chauffeured car I had arranged through Carter earlier that morning. We drove away from the ragged edge of the city and headed directly toward the massive stone pillars of the downtown federal courthouse. The wide concrete plaza in front of the federal building was an absolute circus of chaotic activity. News vans from every major local and national television network were parked haphazardly along the street, with their satellite dishes raised high into the sky. Hundreds of aggressive reporters and determined photographers swarmed the massive concrete steps, holding heavy cameras and extending long microphones. They were all waiting eagerly for the highly anticipated arrival of the tragic victim. The local news broadcasts had spent the entire previous evening and early morning portraying me as a frail, confused old man suffering from severe cognitive decline. They expected to see a broken, vulnerable senior citizen who barely knew his own name stumbling out of a police vehicle in a state of absolute bewilderment. They were preparing to capture images of a weak victim who had narrowly escaped death purely by blind luck. The private black car stopped directly at the base of the massive courthouse steps. The driver quickly got out and opened the heavy rear door. I stepped out onto the pavement, holding Leo firmly by his small hand. The chaotic, loud noise of the massive crowd suddenly dropped to a stunned and echoing murmur. I stood perfectly straight, with my broad shoulders pulled back and my head held high in the cool morning air. The expensive, tailored charcoal suit fit my frame flawlessly. I did not look like a frail, helpless victim, and I certainly did not look confused. I looked like a powerful man who owned the entire city block. The reporters quickly recovered from their initial absolute shock and surged forward like a massive tidal wave. Bright flashbulbs erupted in a blinding strobe of continuous white light, capturing every single detail of my highly confident arrival. A team of federal law enforcement officers quickly formed a tight protective barrier, allowing me to walk steadily and safely up the wide concrete steps. I stopped at the wooden podium set up specifically for press briefings near the massive bronze doors of the courthouse. I adjusted the dense cluster of microphones and looked directly out into the sea of waiting, eager faces. I did not shed a single fake tear, and I did not play the role of the devastated, broken husband. I did not tremble or stammer into the microphones. I delivered a perfectly clear and incredibly concise statement detailing the absolute undeniable truth of the past 48 hours. I calmly explained the massive financial fraud my wife had attempted to execute using my own resources. I laid out the exact precise timeline of her brutal assassination attempt, including the hiring of the disgraced demolitions expert and the involvement of her bankrupt secret lover. I detailed her desperate, frantic efforts to fabricate my accidental death in the rushing river, just to trigger the massive $20 million life insurance payout. I spoke with the precise, calculated authority of a seasoned corporate structural engineer. The hundreds of reporters listened in absolute stunned silence, hanging onto every single word I spoke. The narrative they had prepared for their morning broadcasts was completely shattering right in front of their eyes. The most critical moment arrived when a loud, aggressive reporter in the front row asked about the medical power of attorney. He shouted a specific question regarding my supposedly severe and rapidly advancing cognitive decline. I smiled a very cold and incredibly sharp smile. I unlatched my heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a thick roll of large architectural documents. I unrolled the pristine, highly detailed blueprints right there on the wooden podium for every single television camera to clearly see. I explained in a loud, commanding voice that these were the highly advanced schematics for the custom digital security network I had personally designed and installed in my massive estate just 2 years ago. I detailed the complex thermal imaging algorithms, the hidden masonry lenses, and the heavily encrypted firewall bypass protocols I utilized to monitor the hired assassins in real time from a remote location. I challenged any medical professional or any person in that massive crowd to look at those massive, complicated mathematical diagrams and tell me I possessed a failing mind. I explained how I systematically dismantled the financial empire of the man trying to kill me using complex offshore blind trusts and proxy corporate takeovers. I proved beyond any shadow of a legal or medical doubt that my mental acuity was absolutely flawless and sharper than ever. The forged dementia diagnosis signed by the corrupt private neurologist was instantly destroyed on national television. It was no longer viewed as a tragic, unavoidable medical condition. I publicly exposed the fraudulent document as a malicious, highly weaponized legal tool utilized by greedy, entitled relatives to silence, control, and rob vulnerable senior citizens. I shone a massive bright spotlight on a silent epidemic of elder abuse, showing the world exactly how the legal system can be manipulated to erase a perfectly healthy person. The public narrative shifted with the speed and force of a violent lightning strike. The reporters completely stopped asking questions tinged with fake pity and immediately began asking questions filled with genuine, deep awe. The media commentators watching the live broadcast instantly hailed me as a brilliant tactical mastermind who successfully outsmarted a lethal and heavily funded federal conspiracy. The story was no longer about a tragic, broken family destroyed by greed. It became an incredible, triumphant saga of a seasoned intellect completely destroying reckless, arrogant youth. I had single-handedly dismantled a corrupt network of hired assassins dirty vice detectives, and a sociopathic spouse without ever raising my voice or firing a single physical weapon. I used my silence, my patience, and my absolute technological superiority to trap the predators in their own intricate webs. I looked down at Leo, who was standing bravely and quietly by my side watching the flashing cameras with wide, curious eyes. I gave his small, warm hand a gentle, reassuring squeeze. The world now knew exactly who I was and what I was fully capable of doing to protect my blood. I turned away from the massive cheering crowd and walked through the heavy bronze doors of the federal courthouse. The thick doors closed heavily behind us, shutting out the noise of the press and the flashing lights. I walked confidently down the polished marble hallway, ready to formally testify and finalize the absolute total legal destruction of the woman who had foolishly tried to burn my world to ash. The wheels of federal justice grind exceedingly slow, but they grind with absolute and terrifying finality. 6 months after the dramatic arrest on the Northern Interstate, I sat in the front row of the federal courtroom in the heart of the city. The massive space was constructed of dark, polished oak and carried the heavy weight of absolute authority. The air inside was cool and entirely still. Valerie stood before the towering wooden bench of the presiding federal judge. She wore a shapeless, standard-issue beige prison uniform that completely swallowed her once glamorous figure. Her hair had lost its expensive salon shine and hung limply around her pale face. She looked small and entirely ordinary. The judge did not offer a single ounce of leniency or pity. He read the massive list of federal convictions in a booming voice that echoed off the high vaulted ceiling. He explicitly condemned her calculated cruelty and her absolute willingness to sacrifice an innocent child for sheer financial gain. He called her actions a profound betrayal of the most basic human trust. The heavy wooden gavel fell with a loud, sharp crack that signaled the end of her life as she knew it. Valerie received a mandatory sentence of 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. She would be an old, forgotten woman long before she ever took another breath of free air. She collapsed into her wooden chair, completely broken and weeping silently. Pierce stood in the adjacent courtroom later that same afternoon. He lacked the arrogant defiance he once displayed in the underground parking garage. He kept his eyes glued to the scuffed floor tiles while the judge handed down a solid 20-year sentence for his central role in the conspiracy. The wealthy real estate mogul, who thought he could buy the entire world, was reduced to a simple sequential inmate number. I watched the armed federal marshals lead them both away in heavy steel chains, feeling absolutely nothing but the cool, quiet satisfaction of a job entirely finished. While the criminal courts handled the permanent removal of their physical freedom, my elite team of corporate attorneys handled the absolute dissolution of my toxic marriage. The civil proceedings were incredibly swift and entirely one-sided. Because Valerie was officially convicted of a violent federal felony against me and my young son, the standard marital asset distribution laws were completely nullified by the presiding family court judge. I finalized the divorce paperwork in a matter of weeks, ensuring she left the marriage with absolutely nothing but the cheap prison clothes on her back. She did not get a single penny from my corporate accounts. She did not retain any property rights or spousal support. Her name was permanently erased from every legal document connected to my entire existence. Once the legal ties were completely severed, I immediately listed the sprawling suburban estate on the open market. I knew I could never sleep peacefully in a house where hired men had crawled through the dark basement with industrial explosives. I sold the property to a massive corporate development firm for a substantial cash profit. I packed only the essential items that carried genuine sentimental value and drove away from the manicured lawns and the toxic memories forever. The old life was completely dismantled, leaving a clean, empty slate to build a proper future upon. I took the massive capital from the sale of the compromised property and purchased a breathtaking expanse of land high up in the northern mountains. It was a place of rugged natural beauty, completely surrounded by ancient towering pines and clear, cold alpine lakes. I spent the next several months personally designing and overseeing the careful construction of our new home. This was not just a beautiful, sprawling mountain estate. It was a heavily fortified sanctuary built to withstand any conceivable physical or digital threat. I integrated advanced biometric security protocols, reinforced structural steel framing, and an independent, sustainable solar power grid. The high-definition perimeter cameras were completely invisible, and the property line was impenetrable. Inside the thick walls, the home was filled with warm, natural light, rich, dark wood tones, and the comforting smell of burning cedar. It was a fortress of absolute, total peace. Leo thrived in our new remote environment. The crisp mountain air brought a permanent, healthy color to his cheeks, and the constant fear completely left his eyes. I enrolled him in an elite private academy located in the nearby valley. The prestigious school specialized in advanced sciences and structural engineering concepts. He quickly made genuine loyal friends who shared his deep curiosity about how the world was built. I watched him run across the massive green lawns of the campus, entirely free from the dark, terrifying shadow his mother had cast over his early childhood. He was safe, and he finally knew it. My temporary retirement officially ended that year. The horrifying ordeal with Valerie and Pierce had exposed a massive critical vulnerability operating silently within our modern society. I realized that thousands of wealthy, vulnerable seniors were quietly suffering under the predatory control of greedy, impatient relatives. They were being manipulated, drugged, and systematically robbed by the exact people who were supposed to love and protect them. I decided to weaponize my vast financial resources and my technological expertise to create a massive, unbreakable shield for those who could not fight back. I established a highly specialized cybersecurity and financial forensics firm headquartered in the city. I recruited the absolute best digital auditors, former federal investigators, and aggressive legal experts in the country, including Carter, who eagerly accepted a lucrative position as my chief operations officer. Our firm completely bypassed the slow traditional law enforcement channels. We worked directly with targeted seniors and their loyal advocates to secretly untangle fraudulent financial webs, expose forged medical documents, and completely destroy predatory heirs before they could strike. We built unbreakable offshore digital trusts and installed invisible surveillance networks that caught elder abusers in the exact act of theft. The firm became incredibly successful very quickly. We were a quiet, invisible army operating deep in the digital shadows, striking with overwhelming legal and financial force before the predators even realized they were being actively hunted. I transformed the absolute darkest chapter of my personal life into a powerful beacon of protection for others. The heavy winter snow is falling steadily outside the thick, reinforced windows of my mountain estate tonight. The massive stone fireplace is roaring, casting a warm, flickering orange glow across the polished hardwood floors. I am sitting in my comfortable leather armchair, sipping a glass of warm, spiced cider. The entire house is completely silent, except for the soothing crackling of the dry firewood and the soft, rhythmic clicking of small plastic pieces snapping together. Leo is sitting on the thick woven rug near the warm hearth. He is intensely focused on building a massive, complex architectural model of a futuristic suspension bridge. I watch his small hands move with incredible precision and absolute, total confidence. He has inherited my analytical mind and my deep, endless patience. He does not build things carelessly or rush the process. He studies the foundation, he understands the complex load-bearing principles, and he constructs something that will easily stand the test of time. I take a slow, deep breath of the fragrant cedar air, allowing the profound peace to settle into my bones. The world outside these reinforced walls is chaotic and filled with dangerous, arrogant people who foolishly mistake quiet kindness for frailty and weakness. They believe loud, aggressive threats and physical intimidation are the ultimate sources of true power. I proved them entirely wrong. I completely destroyed a lethal federal conspiracy and dismantled a massive criminal enterprise without ever raising my voice or firing a single physical weapon. I protected my only son and permanently secured our entire future using nothing but careful calculation and absolute discipline. I proved that a man's greatest and most terrifying weapon is never his physical strength. It is his silent, unbreakable intellect. The most profound lesson from this story is that true power does not reside in loud threats or physical intimidation. It lives in silent observation, meticulous calculation, and the unbreakable will to protect one's loved ones. People often make the fatal mistake of underestimating those who choose peace, confusing their quiet endurance with weakness or obsolescence. However, when pushed to the absolute limit, a seasoned intellect armed with patience will always outmaneuver reckless greed. Ultimately, the story teaches us that the most formidable traps are never made of iron, but are constructed from the very arrogance and deceit of those who seek to harm us. If you believe that a father's quiet intellect will always defeat reckless greed, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below.